All right, this is going to be a fun one. So, hello everybody. This is Dr. Robert Ryan, and I'm doing a rather interesting experiment here. I'm working on a three-way kind of mutual interview with Alexander Elung and Alex Ebert, and basically we and many of my other friends are doing some rather interesting projects, and we see opportunity to help each other and maybe guide each other forward collaboratively. And the only way to know the level of fit is to talk about ourselves. So the purpose of this video is going to be, kind of a speed, almost like speed dating. We're going to be doing some speed discussion about what projects we're working on, what brought us to this, and really what our selling point is. Why do we think people should care? Why now? Why is this so interesting? And how are we going to convince other people to get on our team on these topics? So I'm going to kick things off with Alexander Elung, who I've only recently met through the intellectual deep web. Nice to meet you in person, formally. And I'm going to start with the question of who are you and what are you working on?
Well, I'm based in Copenhagen, and I'm a composer and a screenwriter and a playwright. So before I became any of those things, I was a lawyer and was writing a PhD in law, and then gave that up rather quickly after I discovered that there wasn't like a community around philosophy of law in Copenhagen. And I've always had a passion for writing fiction, and I've been writing fiction since I was very, very small. But unfortunately, I was told that that wasn't a realistic life goal. It turned out that it was. So after I quit studying law or working with law, I very, very quickly established myself as a fiction writer, and I've been doing that ever since. And then I've been very lucky to write music for theater mainly, and some short films. As basically a passion. Is not my main income, but it's something I do because I really, really love it. I write a lot of television shows, mainstream television shows, but recently I've written a play about Carl Jung and the Red Book, which is, and if you don't know Carl Jung, he is like a very, very famous psychologist who was mentored by Freud, of course. And they had differing opinions about what the nature of the subconscious was, where Freud's idea was that it was all about like repressed sexuality. And Jung really believed that there was deeper layers to the subconscious, and we had a shared history through what Jung called the collective unconscious. And after him and Freud had what you would call a breakup, he spent 4 years having intense, hardcore hallucinations. And he would write these down in a giant red book. I have it here. 2 seconds. This monstrosity right here, which is filled with calligraphy and his paintings, where he journals his hallucinations and his adventures through the subconscious. And it's super, super complex, very hard to read. But I have adapted it into a theater play, and it has just recently been bought by a theater here in Copenhagen, who are financing me. I've finished the play now, but I'm financing it. So that's basically what I'm doing right now.
That's fascinating. That is really fascinating. So could you elaborate a little more on basically how you made your connections to get to this point? I'm kind of curious, because these are unusual jobs. These are unusual situations.
Yeah, my family has been in theater for 5 generations or something like that. So basically my version of rebellion was studying law.
I love it.
And it just so happened that I really enjoyed it. but the idea of working in a law office seemed extremely alien to me. But I really loved legal philosophy, and I'm of course like really, really interested in philosophy in general. And I spent most of my free time reading and writing about philosophy. So for me, it was like it was a natural way to go to return to my roots and then go into fiction writing and making music. So I basically started as what's called a reader for a production company, where you just read like 7 or 8 manuscripts a week, and you like decide, well, is this suitable for production or isn't it? And it turns out that's really the best way to learn how to write. So I became
fascinating, because it makes perfect sense that just like a lot of great bands in the music industry came out of A&R, where that basically, if you play the role of the gatekeeper or the editor, it's usually considered to be the easiest way to master the sense of what's going to be a hit and what's not.
Absolutely. And then I started writing, like my own preferred genre is magical realism. So that's what I really want to write. But Denmark is a very small country, as you're probably aware. So that means there's less of an audience, and that means that you basically have to write things that appeal to the masses. So that's what I'm doing as like a bread and butter job. And then I've been very fortunate that people enjoy my writing to an extent that they allow me to write more absurd things. So I've been working on my play about Jung and the Red Book for 2 years, just between other jobs. And then I talked to a theater director from a rather large Danish theater, and I've been writing a movie about Niels Bohr before, the Danish scientist who like made the atomic model. And I was writing a movie about him and the whole nuclear arms race. And that movie unfortunately never happened because of COVID. But then he was like, do you have any other ideas? And I was like, yeah, I have this really interesting idea about Carl Jung and his descent into madness, and how like modern psychology in some way came out of that. So that's what I've been doing these last couple of...
bringing that in terms of relevance. So the question being, why should we care? I want to just throw something out here. There does seem to be waves of interest in, say, historical or intellectual topics, right? In the arts and in entertainment. Where, for a long period of time, nobody does a movie about a particular intellectual topic or interest, and then all of a sudden there's a wave. So do you perceive there as being any sort of wave going on here?
Absolutely. I think there is, like, Freud was more adopted into philosophy than Jung was, and for good reason to some extent, because it's much easier to make Freud's writings intellectual. Jung is a very, and understand me right when I'm saying this, a very feminine writer, in the sense that a lot of his ideas are based on like emergence into the experience. So he focuses on the image itself and how that feels from a phenomenological perspective, how it feels to engage with the image. And that's not a very nice thing if you're trying to be an like intellectual philosopher in France. So like Sharpe, Lacan, Derrida, Deleuze, like all these motherfuckers, they mainly focused on Freud because like his idea of sexuality was much easier to digest in an intellectual way. But the problem is that Freud was a materialist, just like Marx, and a lot of other Marx was a dialectical materialist, and we can get into that, of course, but that's a more nuanced version of, let's say, the reductionist materialism we know from modern science. But what I'm sensing is going on in our current zeitgeist is a search of the soul, and a way to understand that in a way where we're not just abandoning reason and going into like blind faith, because what really happened with the idea of religion and faith was that after the Enlightenment, like the whole way we understood reality was really changed, because before that everything was symbolic. Like when you read like alchemy, which was like a proto version of chemistry, simple and material world was combined. So it wasn't just about like the transformation of particles, but also how that like had a similarity to the transformation of the soul. But the Enlightenment basically changed that, because we, through dualism, separated the soul from materia entirely. And then we didn't know what to do with the soul at all. So we just focused on materialist science. And that has left us with a longing after a way to reconnect with the soul. And that's basically what Jung is trying to do. So I think we're slowly coming back to it now, because like psychology is going back into studying psychedelics. And we're starting to have like a new renaissance of the psyche and the soul.
Yeah, there's a big push towards non-dualism, and so finding some way to unite various different fields of knowledge, and as you suggest, you know, basically the search for meaning. You know.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then of course a lot of our friends in the intellectual podcast world are talking about sense making and meaning collaboration. All of these topics, and so making sense of the world is more than just knowing which newspaper you should trust. It also involves knowing which myths actually matter. You know, so we have all sorts of myths. We have more myths than we've ever had before in our public discourse. The question is which really matter. You know, and so,
at least more polarized. I don't know if we have more myths, but they're at least more polarizing. But I think people like, sorry?
Way that has never been accomplished in world history. We're churning them out. The question is, which ones are any good? And, you know.
Yeah, that separately, that's a really interesting question, because, I mean, from a Jungian perspective, you could probably argue that all myths that arises comes from the subconscious. So like we before we started this podcast, we had a conversation about like how different ideas are basically fractions of a soul idea. Like we talked about the disco ball or Goethe's crystal.
Yeah, the disco ball metaphor, and I don't want to get in too deep because we want to the format.
But that's a different discussion. But we have a lot of friends like Greg Enriquez, amazing psychologists who have the system of TOK, which is an attempt to like reunite all these different aspects, like all the different lights from the disco ball. John Viavake, Jordan Peterson also, he's attempting a new meta-narrative. Rachel Anderson, Bart. So we're all aiming at the same thing, really, which is trying to create a new meta-narrative. So our understanding of being isn't necessarily so fractured anymore.
You just made my job easy because you summarized it in half the time I was just going to do. So, but it's just the idea that what many of our friends are all attempting to create meta-narratives or grand narratives, which would be the simplest way to describe it, or grand models or meta models. And so they don't necessarily have to be a narrative or a story, as it would be phrased in sort of a humanist philosophy or a continental philosophy as a narrative. But you could also just phrase it as grand models or, you know, theme. So, before we get too lost into all those other details, I want to switch over to Alex Ebert and let him jump in and give us a similar sort of recap of what he's up to, you know, why we should care now, and kind of how we came to this point. But go ahead. Let's start with what are you up to?
Oh man, well, thank you for having me here, and that was really fun to listen to, Elung. I didn't know all of that. I love that you're 5 generations deep in playwright familia. That's amazing. I have a similar story with my family that I'll tell you one day, with all of them being some of them, a large part of them being theater people. So in 2004, I got sober in 2002. I was on heroin, right? And then I get sober and I started doing heroin. I realized later because I was trying to approach death and I hadn't gone through a proper death initiation. So I subconsciously, as a neurotic expression of my avoidance of the cultural avoidance of death, I start subconsciously approaching death vis-a-vis heroin. I get sober and I have to become completely aspiritual, because every time I meditated, I would get like overcome and I'd feel like I didn't have any guidance and I would, go do drugs again. So I got super intellectual during that time, in my version of intellectual. I had no real intellectual friends. I had one who ended up becoming a PhD, who I subsequently invited to our little group. And we lived together, 5 of us, all sober. And I started basically going crazy. My mind, once it was sober, just started going. And I started seeing the world in a very different way. And I finally confronted death as a sober man. And one of the things I started doing was writing a book called The Rise and Fall of Edward Sharpe. And it was a novel about this kid who's sent down to Earth, and he sees space as composed of strings. And I was filling these strings and I'm drawing these strings and I'm telling my friends, they said, you should really look up string theory. Now, this is 2004. Lee Smolin's book, 3 Roads to Quantum Gravity, had come out just months earlier. This is pretty new stuff. I had no idea about it. I open up, literally, I pick the first book at Barnes & Noble, I open up and it says the sound of space is a string. And the diagrams look just like my diagrams. And I'm like, holy shit. So I start feeling like I'm onto something. And that sends me down this wormhole where I start developing this pendular mathematics where each zero is has a variable magnitude depending on the context. And, so basically the math would keep oscillating across zero based on the magnitudes of zero. And I called this math magnetic zeros. And then I just started a band called Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros. And only this year, I used to joke, I don't really know the application, and NASA invented a math for Mars called magnetic zeros, which is kind of random. And so I was like, well, it's just a cute little thing from my past. But it has really come back for me in the development of something that I've been calling freq theory. So just a little background on how I ended up where I am right now. As a musician, I'm staring, as Elung knows, and as you know too, Robert, because you have some musical background, when you're mixing songs all day in the box in Pro Tools, you're staring at waveforms all day.
It changes. It really does. I said it really changes you. Like the experience of being a composer or a producer or staring at these waveforms. Every friend of mine that's ever gone on to do something really wacky or great has said they learned something that they never thought they would learn from that.
Yes. That's really interesting to hear you say that. That's kind of almost profound, actually. They have this they have this effect that you just described that's difficult to describe, but I think I've begun to describe it. So freq theory is not really a theory of linguistic expression. It's a semiotic theory that came to me through staring at these shapes. And a little history about about compression. In 1999, 2 things happened. Napster exploded, and sales of CDs went down for the first time in history. And an album by Red Hot Chili Peppers called Californication came out. If you look at the waveform for Californication for the whole album, the only dynamism in the entire album is between songs. Everything else on that album is a literal flat line. It is completely compressed, and that kicked off what they called the loudness wars.
Oh, yes. Rick Rubin and the loudness wars.
Yeah. So this idea of the loudness wars was this idea of lifting the valleys up to the peaks so that you have more loudness more of the time, so that you have a loudness effect. It's not that the loudest point in the song gets louder, it's that more of the song is louder all of the time. Now, what I started to notice while staring at these waveforms is that when you compress a total song, that total compression resembles precisely your noise floor, meaning zero. It resembles precisely nothing.
Right.
So that is obviously represented in a number of ways. We could talk about the collapse of dynamism. So you have these dynamic songs, and then they're compressed into flat lines, and they become non-dynamical. So I started thinking about this in the context of society. We have these dynamical societies, and then we start homogenizing, or we all start atomizing, whatever the case is, and we end up with, again, a flat line. I started thinking about them in the context of all kinds of shit, in the context of my life, in the context of wanting to transcend from angry to happy. I started thinking about them in these ways that I had never considered, and I started drawing out these maps of these waveforms that would go from oscillating nuance and dynamism to compression, and just kind of witnessing that transition, which is also the transition, informational transition from 1919, where we're looking at a total of 15 minutes of media intake per day, maybe an hour per day, like a newspaper and maybe a magazine, to 12.2 hours of media intake per day on average for the average sort of media savvy person. So you have, again, this like dynamism turning into a total compression, saturation of information. So anyway, I started developing this, this notion called freq theory based on these new flat lines that are being created vis-a-vis compression, saturation, collapse, whatever the case, being the new equilibrium around which we then create new oscillations. So that if I'm angry, and I get angry enough, that anger saturates and becomes my new flat line. And I'm no longer angry now. That's my new equilibrium around which I can create happiness. So that this idea of transcendence, and I sort of positivized the deadening, the collapse of dynamism into an equilibrium for the next transcendence. And this idea of phase transitions and emergence all started to peel out of it.
And let me just kind of bookend this, because following our format, we're going to avoid getting in deep right now. Bookending this, so why should people be paying attention to this particularly now, just like I asked Alexander?
Well,
timeliness. Now, I know you know 50 different ways to answer this, but
yeah. Okay, I'll just bring it to my own life and how it's affected me. I think it's a very useful mental model for understanding how society transforms, what it takes to transform, what it takes to create a new equilibrium, to transcend a current paradigm, socially and probably more importantly, personally. There's a wonderful meditation that I learned from reading an Osho book, which is that if you're sad, you're not sad enough. Become more sad, more sad, more sad. Increase the oscillations until it's a flat line. And then it's gone. And it becomes your new subsistence, to use Elung's term, around which your existence then oscillates. And so, yeah, I think it's very useful.
Yeah, there's a lot of different traditions that focus on meditation in this manner of basically ecstatic behavior. So instead of isolation, that basically you push yourself into the pain or the anger, whatever it is, and so basically you can create a magnification, which then becomes a new kind of, like you said, a new normal or a new state from which you can achieve things that you couldn't, without that kind of concentration. So let me go ahead and make a few comments myself, and then we're going to wrap this up, and then we can basically restart and do another video for our next part. I found that the really long videos don't get watched, and so forcing ourselves to be disciplined is like really difficult, but we try, So So in my case, who am I, and how can I bring it into this conversation? So I'm currently a professor at a school called Clayton State University in Atlanta, Georgia, where I teach entrepreneurship, strategy, ethics, whatever it is that basically I can teach that is interesting and fits the bill. I'm working on a course called Video Games, Virtual Worlds in AR, VR. I'm trying to get young Black entrepreneurs interested in these tech spaces, which they normally would not posit. So they come into my class thinking they're going to start a barbershop. And I suggest to them that you can actually create apps to enhance barbershops that already exist in your community, as an example. So it's basically sort of like taking them to a next level of understanding of what these things are accessible. You can really do this, you know. So that's sort of what I've been doing on the ground in my day job. Now, my big work centers around a few basic pieces, and the biggest is the most ambitious project is called World Systems Theory 3.0. And world systems theory is one of the major theories of international relations, and it centers around viewing the world as a system as a whole from the top down. And in a concrete sense, instead of starting from abstract philosophy, we start from real human institutions. We enumerate them, we name them, we describe how they're related to each other, and then we picture the world as a single system that basically moves in harmonics, okay? And so it's all waves and trajectories and, you know, the shifting of dominant powers and paradigms and so forth. And so that's really what it's all about. And I got into that when I was in my undergrad, when I had a professor who was one of the world system scholars. And I always thought it'd be really cool to do that when I grow up, you know. And then basically life got in the way. It took me 9 years to finish my undergrad, and I went off on a long journey of the music industry and trying to save everybody, basically being like this sort of like catcher in the rye figure, running around trying to save people on heroin, roughly at the same time that you were on heroin and everybody else was on heroin. I was the one making sure you didn't die. So I luckily stayed off of it, but most of my friends were on something in a very big major way. My friends were also experimenting with cultish behaviors where it was like, hey, what if we all get together and take acid and then we start meditating on reality? We can create a social movement and all this great stuff. And then, oh, wait, we forgot what we were doing because we're too high, you know, that kind of thing. So a whole lot of like, you know, millennial cultism and that kind of stuff was going on in the space that I was in. So I put school away for a while and started chasing music. I was also in indie rock myself, as well as got into the rave scene, and I was consulting for various different underground rave groups and stuff like that. Which is something I still dabble with. I've worked with the dubstep kids in Philadelphia, for example, recently and stuff like that. So I got it. So guru work is the best way to describe it. I mean, just like behind the scenes guru work where basically I was doing my best to keep people on a good artistic path. Did some serious heavy consulting for some artists that won national awards and stuff like that. Finally got back onto my own, like, look, I was poor. I was not doing, taking care of myself. I was taking care of literally everybody but myself and not getting paid or compensated or being made famous by it at all. So people were like, you know, when are you going to start taking care of yourself? And I said, okay, fine, I'll go back to school. I did my MBA, my master's in economics, and then I went on and got my PhD at University of Pittsburgh. While I was there, I got to hang out in the #1 philosophy of science program in the world that they have coincidentally down the street. And also getting deep into like organizational theory, Herbert Simon, the foundations of artificial intelligence and complexity science at Carnegie Mellon University, which is the sister school for Pitt. So I basically became sort of a jack of all trades, just doing all these intellectual cool things. As I was working on my PhD dissertation, something just kept coming up, and you're going to probably love this, Alex. My basic theory was called harmonic oscillation theory, okay? And so when I saw your work, I was like immediately, okay, this is weird. There's another one of me out there, okay? So basically, my work had to do with trying to understand all organizations as temporal. So and that strategies and structures can only be made sense of in dynamic form, and basically in temporal format. And so, you know, basically everything has its place in time. And so it's all about aligning with the oscillations of what's around you, okay? And of course, I was inspired by music to kind of come to that same direction, just like you did. And so basically, I just kept seeing everything as a symphony, everything just basically as all these different musical parts coming together. And so I got a paper in the best paper proceedings of strategic management. And so I got some early interest. All the smart people thought I was doing well, but they also said it was too ambitious and you're going to have to write a whole book before anybody's going to go down that the rabbit hole with you. Okay, so I made it smaller. It's like, it's a theory of the firm, you know? So I said, here's a theory of businesses as harmonically oscillating competitors and cooperators, so that their strategies always align, and that equilibrium is a zero, basically that competition becomes most efficient when there's sort of a harmonic oscillation pattern that zeroes out. And I also got into the idea of compression. I also got into the idea of there being sort of like a phenomenon called a social pulse and a social flow. And that pulses and flows generated two basically different structures. A pulse would generate a network, and a flow would basically generate what you're talking about, which is basically the emergence of higher order systems from lower order systems that in a more wave function. So basically what you're doing and what I'm doing were very, very, very much the same thing. So when I saw what you were doing, I was thinking, gosh, this is
That's
too
cool.
weird.
Yeah.
It's almost as if so many chapters of your life, you were doing very similar things to what I was doing, just with different people and with different institutions at real similar times.
Yeah.
And it's just like, you know, I can't say I was ever like following you around as a fan, but in retrospect, going back and looking at your career over the past month or two, it just struck me as to how similar that was. So anyway, going back to World Systems Theory 3.0, I realized that basically I was coming full circle. So I contacted my old professor, and he told me that Emanuel Wallerstein and Andre Frank had recently died, and I missed that. So I looked it up. These are the big gurus of world systems theory. 1.0 is Wallerstein, 2.0 is Frank. And so it turns out that my professor inherited their posthumous work. Basically, their incompleted work was dropped on his doorstep. And then he also is serving on the Nobel Prize committee for those two people right now to try to put together the proposal for the Nobel Prize. So I came to him with my theory, and I sent him a bunch of stuff, and he said, I can't say that you're wrong at all. In fact, I'm fascinated, and I can't wait for your book to come out. So I've got the tentative approval from him to do this. And I'm just like, holy shit. It's like, I just thought I was doing some noodling and some stuff, you know, 10 years ago. And next thing you know, I'm like, actually like in the club of the people doing the thing. And how did that happen, you know? So long story short here is that I see a really interesting conversation coming together between us. And so I'm going to kind of wrap it up right now for this video, and just closing comments before we run out of time. Alexander and Alex, go ahead.
Well, I'm overwhelmed. It's so interesting to talk to the both of you, and I really love hearing your stories. I can't wait to continue it in the next part.
Yeah, same. Yeah, I'm frothing.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this, and I'm going to send you guys a link, and we'll get started on the next one. What do you say, 15 minutes? Take a break?
Great, perfect.
That's good.
All right, let's do that. All right, thank you.
All right.
Good.